In chapter 18 of the book of Acts, we see the itinerary of Paul in one of his travels comes to this city. Which city am I in right now? I'm in Corinth, in the middle of the Mediterranean. One of the crossroads of merchandising, of travel, maritime travel. Paul spent 18 months in this location. And where I'm standing right now is in the mountain where Aphrodite was worshipped. To my right, on the top of the stones up there, was the temple of Aphrodite. Now, according to Strabo and some of the historians, and I'm going to read to you, I want to use a lot of the historical accounts because I don't want to give you a spiritual application. I want to give you facts as I'm here in Acrocorinth. According to the Baker's Encyclopedia of the Bible, it says that the distinctive cult of Corinth was the veneration of Aphrodite, a goddess of love, beauty, and fertility who is identified with the Roman god Venus. The summit of the Acrocorinth was dominated by a temple dedicated to her worship, served by over 1,000 sacred prostitutes or slaves priestesses. Associated with such religious practices was a general moral degradation. Corinthian morals were notoriously corrupt, even when compared with pagan Rome. Now, why is that so important to understand? Because in 1 Corinthians, if you come here and you see the itinerary of Paul, and then you come to this location and you start learning about the way they worship, what worship was considered to the Corinthians at that time was a visit to that high place, a high mountain, sacred space, where they used to have immorality. Remember that Acts 15 tells us what we should stay away from when we begin to follow Messiah, Yeshua, and follow the Torah. Staying away from adultery, unclean foods, clearly, meat sacrificed to idols, immorality, and blood. Now, this place would have done every single one of those things. Now, imagine you living in the first century, and everyone that will come through the one sea to the other sea, they have to stop here, not too far from here, maybe about 10 kilometers from this place, the Isthmus. When they used to just bring travel, merchants come through from all over the world, they come to Corinth and they see the high place where Aphrodite was worshipped. And now they come here, and trust me, is way, way up here. When you walk, you come here with the purpose of immorality, fornication. When the Bible says about fornication, is the context of what took place here. Ritual sex. The ritual sex involved meat sacrifice to idols and the veneration of the goddess and the gods in this location. So to them, having this type of immoral sex was worship. No wonder they motivated people to worship their gods. As you imitate it, you become what you imitated and what you worship. You become whom you worship. Just like in this week's Torah portion. In the Torah portion, it talks about when they worship the golden calf. And then the Bible says that Israel is a stiff-necked people, just as the calf is being led with a stiff neck. So are the people in the first century are worshiping that up there. And it included degradation and immorality. But to them was worship. So they didn't see anything wrong. As we go down the mountain and we go to the ancient city of Corinth, we will see how that also implied worshiping Asclepius and also Athena and also some of the other gods of Apollo. They have cafeterias. They could eat this. The citizens, they had the right to go eat in those cafeterias. That's why Paul is saying you cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and of the devil. We have to separate the holy and the profane. And this location teaches you perfectly what is profane in the eyes of God and what Paul was dealing with in the first century in the First Corinthian church. We are at the zenith, at the top of the Acrocorinth in Corinth. I mean, this is a beautiful sight. And right behind me, you see the connection between two seas in which commerce was extremely important. And now you can understand why Paul came to this location as a logistically stay here in order to minister to people coming from all over the world. But I want to talk a little bit more about Acrocorinth because we are at the top right now. It's a beautiful sight. You can see 360 degrees, the beauty of it. And we will talk about the Isthmus in a minute, but I want to give you some history about this location. Where I'm standing would have been the location of the Temple of Aphrodite. And I got to tell you, to me, it's incredible to think that these people were so desperate to worship a goddess of fertility that they have to come all the way to the top of the mountain, which is no easy task. But it also tells you something about their mindset. Anyone who would come here, it was premeditated. It was no accident. It's not like you just took the wrong turn to go worship a God not knowing. Here you knew that you came to worship. That included immorality and fornication. Let me give you some more information about the location of the Acrocorinth. The Acropolis of the ancient city of Corinth, home of the temple Aphrodite. Acrocorinth is the highest Corinth. It's a great limestone twin summit peak with a linking saddle. It's located southwest of the ancient city of Corinth in the Gulf of Corinth and Saronic Gulf. So you have two gulfs here that connects. Now they connect because of the Isthmus. They have a canal there that was finished by the French in the late 1800s. It's very interesting because back in the day, this was a high point, sacred mount, sacred space, cosmic mountain of the Corinth community. You see that in Mesopotamia, in Egypt. You see that all over the world. You see that in Athena. The Parthenon is located in the high mount. It's consistent throughout the ancient Near East in regards to these things. This is located 1,800 feet, 1,886 feet of elevation. Trust me, it's a hike. So here Strabo talks about this place, but it's also well water in all sides. They had a spring coming out of it. I don't know how the water came up here, but they had everything they needed in order to do what they did. It was also protection in history in the Ottoman Empire and the Byzantine period. But we're focusing only on the first century perspective and how the importance of this. What's the biblical relevance of this place? At the site of the Aphrodite's temple, the Acrocorinth is important for understanding the Greco-Roman religious context of Paul's Corinthians epistles. Now, the Athenians likely fabricated a story of the temple of Aphrodite having 1,000 devotee prostitutes. Strabo talks about this. The sexual immorality, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 on, is rampant in the community down below, here to my right. Only understanding its location, understanding what you're looking at, you get a perception and you get an understanding of the high level of corruption, moral corruption that was going on in the first century congregation. Now we understand why Paul was so adamant about talking to them about the Torah in the context of holiness according to the standards of the Bible and not according to the culture of its time. It is important to understand that at this high place, many people were coming and mixing the holy and profane. If you live in the Roman culture, Greco-Roman world, to you it was just, okay, I could go and have sex, immorality, but it's worship. Paul now has the challenge to contrast God's righteousness and morality versus the ancient world's perception of justice, worship, and morality. Right behind me you can see two gulfs being connected through the great work of the French back in the 1800s. We have the Saronic Gulf to my left, and you have the Gulf of Corinth to my right. Now, please understand that in the first century, this was a hub of business. Everyone coming from the east will come to this Gulf, the Saronic Gulf. They unload their boats. Then there was a track from the Saronic to the Gulf of Corinth. And then they will load the boats again to get them to Rome. It was a very important location for business. As a matter of fact, we know that freedmen built this city after it was destroyed back in 144 BC. And then after, it was rebuilt again by the Romans 100 years later. It became the hub and an extremely important city of the ancient world. If you want to come and really reach the gospel to the great amount of people, this was the place. Thousands of people will come, especially for the Isthmian Games, and which we will go there later. But I want to focus a little bit more about what is called the Isthmus. It's the neck. If you can see to the north, we'll be going towards Athens. To the south, we'll be going to the peninsula here. But in order for them to do business, that was considered the Isthmus, the neck, what will connect one from the other. And that there was a very important location as a port, one of the greatest ports of the ancient world. Let me read you some information about the location. The Corinthian Isthmus was not even 5 miles wide at its narrowest point. And Periander built a paved road called Dilkos in the 6th century BC. It says, which allowed the transport of goods and small boats from one shore to the other, thus avoiding the much longer and often dangerous sea voyage According to Strabo, if you go down the peninsula, it was too dangerous. So therefore now, they have to do something to make sure that they don't have problems with losing product, more or less. So they built a paved road to transport the goods from one side to the next one. I mean, I find it so amazing now that as we are here in this location, at the top of the Acrocorinth, where Aphrodite was worshipped here, we can really see the beauty of the whole panoramic picture here and what it would have looked like in the first century in the time of Paul. Specifically, when you're dealing with business and all the ships coming from my right, my left, Saronic Gulf, and going towards Rome from the Gulf of Corinth. It's important to understand the history, the topography, and the geography to better understand the biblical narrative. We are in the ancient city of Corinth. Right behind me you have a temple of the Imperial cult. Why is that important? Because it showed that this community here, the city, was a Roman colony, and it was dedicated to the worship of the Imperial emperor. So therefore, it was dedicated to the sister. We read over here, it tells us that it was according to Pausanias' description, this temple appears to have been dedicated to Octavia, the sister of Augustus. So this is important to know, because then you have loyalty being given to the emperor. The community here, they have to deal with worshiping now also the emperor and a particular temple to his sister. And we need to remember that in the ancient world, as we saw in the Acrocorinth and the Aphrodite worship. A lot of these things show loyalty to those particular types of worship. And now we know that a lot of the people here believed in the gospel and in Yeshua the Messiah. Now consider the different types of caste system and how they have to now come together with different social status, and they have to deal with the different type of things of David everyday life, like the worship of, Imperial cult. We just found out here in the museum that they had over 40 dining rooms for the worship of Demeter and some of the other gods in the area. Now we understand how eating meat sacrificed to idols was a huge centerpiece of the message of Paul in 1 Corinthians. I am standing in a place that to me is very important. It's called the Bema. And this is for us is important because we have evidence in the New Testament in regards to Paul being brought here in the city of Corinth because he was teaching the gospel in the agora, or in the forum here, in this area here, that they had a place that philosophers, Stoics, and other people trying to express their views about life can stand, and they can teach the people. Well, Paul was teaching about the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his son Yeshua. And by the accusation of the leaders in this place, they brought him to Gallio. Now, let me give you some information who Gallio was. Did you know that Gallio was born in Spain? Watch this. It says Gallio, who was Seneca's son and brother of philosopher Seneca, who lived in the 3 BC to 65 AD, born in Córdoba, Spain. He was Spaniard. Okay, and Gallio came to Rome during Tiberius' reign. His given name was Marcus Annaeus Novatus, but he assumed the name Gallio after his adoption. So therefore, he came here. Now, why is this important? Because we have now evidence, historical evidence, apart from the Bible, that tells us that there was a man named Gallio who came here, and he became a proconsul of this particular province. Gallio served as a Roman proconsul in Actea sometime between 51 and 53. During the apostles' first visit to Corinth, the Jews brought the apostle before the proconsul, accusing him of having persuading the people to practice religion in an unlawful way. Now, Gallio, he decided not to press charges. Why? Because Augustus Caesar, he already gave privileges to the Jewish people all over the empire to have the freedom of religion. And that's why when you read the text in the book of Acts, which tells you that you can rule according to your law, that is biblical and historical evidence that what Gallio said is exactly what Augustus Caesar said, and that's why the Jews have free access to the Greco-Roman world in order for them to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and not to mix themselves with the imperial cult prevalent in the city of Corinth. This is, again, one more piece of evidence that tells us how accurate the Bible is. And now we know that Paul is not just some made-up figure. It's a real person in a real location, in a real geography, with some real historical backgrounds to prove his existence and the validity of the Bible. In chapter 18, verse 2, I want to read those verses. I want you to get something interesting. There's a lot of history in those verses. I'm standing, and behind me you see the temple of Apollo, and in the foreground, all the way in the back, you see Acrocorinth. Okay, so we talked about that already. It says in verse 2 to verse 3, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who have arrived recently from Italy, along with Priscilla, his wife, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to depart from Rome. Okay, let's talk a little bit about history. It's interesting that when Paul gets here, there are two Jewish people who came from Rome. Now, what happened in Rome that he found them here? That's really what we need to find out. And by the way, if we establish who was the emperor at the time of when Paul came here, then we'll know who Gallio was, because Gallio was appointed by this particular emperor at that time frame. Okay, so Claudius ruled during the time of the greatest missionary expansion of the early congregation. So he played a significant role in the experience of the first, missionary, in this case, Paul. Now, as we go through, we understand that in the first century, this is interesting because Suetonius, one of the historians Roman historians, explains that the cause of the expulsion of the Jews from Rome was because constantly they were rioting according to imporsore Christo, an investigation of Christ, meaning that they thought that the Jews in Rome were arguing with the believers, the Jewish believers in Rome, and also with the believers who were Gentiles in regards to Messiah. Okay, they call it the Christos or Christ. Now, what's interesting is that now when Peter says that he has become the rock of offense, Yeshua become the rock of offense. Now we understand really what that means. That during the time of Claudius, the emperor who appointed Gallio, who was here at the time when Paul was judged by the Jewish people in this city of Corinth, the connection between the history of Rome and Corinth is interlinked by who appointed Gallio, in this case Claudius, the emperor of Rome, because he expelled the Jewish people due to the controversy of Messiah Yeshua. So now we're understanding that believing in Yeshua was a huge controversy. Why? Because it challenged the authority of the emperor. You have to accept that Yeshua is Kyrios. I learned something new. It's not Kurios. From a Greek person here, I learned that it's Kyrios. Kyrios. So he is the Lord, the master. So the contrast of the emperor as your master versus Yeshua as the master, that was the rock of offense to the Gentiles and also to the Jewish people, as Yeshua is the Messiah of Israel. As I'm walking through one of the main roads, it's one of the agora, the marketplace. To my left and to my right, you have shops right over here that you can see. Right behind me, you have the Bema. So therefore, Paul would have been brought through this particular place or one of the other major roads in the city of Corinth. But one of the things of interest that I think we need to consider is the caste system of Rome. The caste system was established all over the Greco-Roman world, and we know, and we talked about this before, you have slaves, freedmen, plebs, you have patricians, and they have all the more high-level officials in the Roman community and Roman society. But here they found something quite interesting, which actually shows the evidence that when Paul is writing to Corinthians, he's not necessarily talking to the regular slaves or the freedmen, but also to people of status, like somebody named Erastus. Erastus, let me read you some information here. As you know, this particular trip is more focused not on spiritual application, more on facts and information that we can grasp and understand more or less what the context of the first century is trying to tell us through the book of Acts. It says the biblical context, while Paul was in Corinth, he wrote and sent greeting letters, from some of the Corinthians to the congregation in Rome. Among them was named Erastus. Erastus was who Paul describes as the city treasurer. It's interesting because another translator calls him the director of public works. And each city elected yearly a magistrate and a senate. The city manager was also elected annually and managed public works in the city, including financial income. Now in 2 Timothy, we know chapter 4, verse 20, it mentions Erastus. Erastus remained in Corinth, but Trophimus and I left behind Miletus because he was sick. So what does this tell us? We know, and the archaeologists found the inscription somewhere in here, testifying that Erastus was actually a high-level citizen of this particular community who actually donated a sidewalk, becoming a benefactor of the city. And then he had particular honor and status. Now, with that being said, not only was the gospel reaching the poor and the slaves and the marginalized, but it's also making a huge inroad into the high-level status in society in the Greco-Roman world. Although the Bible does not mention the place where I'm standing right now, I'm so happy and excited to be here. It's the city of Isthmian. Now, it's interesting because when you read the book of Corinthians, you notice certain language, and then Paul is using the language of athletes, and you're going to get a crown, and you have ran the good race. Well, where I'm standing, they had what is called the Isthmian Games. Let me read you some information about what used to go on here. Not only did they have a temple of Poseidon, which is the god of the sea, and clearly you can see, how close it is to the Saronic Gulf. So I think it's interesting that when we read the Bible, sometimes we don't pay attention to the culture and the games. Games were important in the Greco-Roman world. So the Isthmian Games, what is this about? Corinth was also prominent because of the Isthmian Games. Now, we're not too far. We're like 10 minutes away from this ancient city of Corinth right now. But remember, it's for the Isthmian Games from Isthmia. And it would just go on to different locations. It's like a type of Olympic type thing, okay? Now, watch. Let me tell you how that took place. The Isthmian Games occurred in the first and the third years of the Olympiad of the 4-year period between Olympic Games. It's like the Pan American Games and the World Games. They do it between the Olympic Games, the same thing. They were supposed to originated by the mythical king Sisyphus, and the date is from 523 BC. A competition centered on 3 kinds of events: equestrian, gymnastics, and music. Now, I just learned in the museum here that they were doing pancration, which is some type of wrestling. They did boxing. They also did music type talent thing, shows, and things like that. So they took place here in Isthmia. Now, it says, by the New Testament period, the games were influenced by Roman civilization. So chariot racing and other spectacles were probably added to the Hellenistic competitions. In allusion to athletic contests, Paul mentions both running and boxing. 1 Corinthians, I'm going to, by the way, let me finish and then I'll read the verse. It says, the price of winning the games were a wreath made of myrtle, olive, pine branches, plus additional benefits: stipend from the state, remission of taxes, and a special benefit for the champion's children. Winners were national heroes. So 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24 to 26 says, do not know that those who run in the stadium all run, but one receives the prize. Run in such a way that you may win, and everyone who competes exercises self-control in all things. Thus, those do so in order that they may receive a perishable crown. He's talking about what happened here. But we an imperishable one. Therefore, I run in this way, not as running aimlessly. I box in this way, not as beating the air. And I discipline my body and subjugate it, lest someone, after preaching to others, I myself should become disqualified. So now when we read this particular verses, 1 Corinthians 9, he is using the language of the things that were taking place very near Corinth, or also in Corinth, because the games were being transferred from place to place. It's called the Isthmian Games. and it took place during the spring. Now remember, between imperial cult, the worship of Aphrodite, the worship of Apollo, the worship of Demeter, the worship of Poseidon, and they have cafeterias, and they worship and they sacrifice to them, and they were eating meat sacrificed to idols, plus winning the races. Clearly, Paul is dealing with a lot of cultural backgrounds that needs to be talked about in order for us to get a better understanding of the first century biblical narrative. It's interesting that as I travel throughout Athens, and I'm in Corinth, I went to Acrocorinth, we went to Thessaloniki, we also went to Philippi, but I'm finding myself in a very interesting location that the Bible tells us about. We just spent some time in Isthmian, which is the city in which they held the Isthmian Games. Very significant to the context of the 1 Corinthians. Now, in the Acts chapter 18, verse 18, says this: "So Paul, after remaining many days longer, said farewell to the brothers and sailed away to Syria. And with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shaved his head, at Cenchrea." This is the ancient port of Cenchrea. Now, a few events occurred here clearly. Paul came here because he was going to travel to Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, and he went to Ephesus, as the Bible tells us. We were there on our trip, as you remember. So here we know that the evidence, biblical evidence, that talks to us about the archaeological also is included, how the archaeology has found the place. We have the ancient port in which Paul came to here. Literally, we are in the footsteps of Paul, and he shaved his head because he did a Nazirite vow. So a lot of the things happen over here. Now, let me read you some extra biblical sources to validate this particular point here. I want to get it for you. Philo, in the works of Philo, complete and unabridged, and he says, "A legion crossing over the isthmus into the opposite gulf, having arrived in Cenchrea," right here, the dockyard of the Corinthians, right there. "He was compelled by the guards, who would not permit him the slightest respite, to embark immediately on board a small transport and to set sail, as a foul wind was blowing with great violence." And it says, "And after great suffering, he and difficulty arrived to this place." Now, it's interesting because the book of Acts, chapter 27, verse 9 to 10 says this: "And because considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, because even the fast, Yom Kippur, was already over, Paul strongly recommended, saying to them, 'Man, I appreciate that the voyage is going to end with disaster.' I perceive that the voyage is going to end with disaster and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Why? Because he understood the maritime travel. We learned as we were in Troy that they used to know the times and seasons, and they had a maritime travel. Go on Google and you can look it up, and you can see, even today, they have basically sea highways, if you can call it that. They go from island to island. So it was in the ancient world. And they used to have maritime travel between early March all the way to September, from September or late September all the way to late February. They would not embark because of the winds, because it was dangerous. I remember that Paul already had an episode that he had a shipwreck. So we know that this is true. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bible not only tells us how to live our spiritual walk, but the scriptures also teaches us about archaeology and history. It teaches us about cultural backgrounds. And here right now where I'm standing, where Paul took a Nazirite, he shaved his head because he took a Nazirite vow, in which he came to fulfillment of that vow in Acts chapter 21 when he was arrested. We are right here in the location when he shaved his head, and the ancient city and the ancient port of Cenchrea. A really cool, exciting place. We are right now in the neck of the northern part going towards Athena, and the southern part going towards Corinth, right? We are in what is called the Isthmus. It's a neck. And in the time of Paul, that's the Saronic Gulf, and that's the Corinth of the Gulf of Corinth. And they have a road, and we're going to go there next. And they used to take the ships, bring them on that road, and pull it to the other side, or they would disembark the people and unload all the goods and then take them over to the other side, to the Gulf of Corinth, and then reload it on another ship. Now, obviously, that costs money, and that takes a lot of effort. So, in the time of the late 1800s, somewhere in the 1870s, the French engineers, they began to dig this up. Now, the emperors of Rome wanted to do the same thing too, but they had no success. But it wasn't until the late 1800s that they finished this canal. This was an important point of interest back in the time of Paul in the first century, in which it was a very important ports coming from the east, going to the west, Rome. And the moment that this was done now you have ships come through here, obviously not huge ones, but it facilitated for commerce, and now it's more for tourism and it's more transports. But it's interesting because back in the day of Paul, in the day when Paul was here, they have to unload and then reload it on the other side. It's about 4 miles. So it's quite interesting what technology can do, and this is what we see today. It's called the Isthmus. It's the canal. One of my bucket lists. I always wanted to be here, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to come and see the way it is now than trying to connect the way that it was back in the day in the first century.